All right, so thank you very much for the introduction, and buenos dias to all my Spanish colleagues, and good morning to everyone else who speaks in English. But I'm very proud and excited to present our work today, Marked for Disruption. And in essence, this work is a quantitative analysis of 3 malware delivery operations that were specifically targeted for takedown. And what we try to answer, at least to begin to answer, is how these operations in general, what their behaviors are in the context of a takedown. Some faces to name. So these are the co-authors, 2 of my former professors, Professor Murdoch and Professor Stringini, as well as Dr. Yin Shen. And I've just had the pleasure of working with them for so many years. I'd just like to take this opportunity to thank them for putting up with me for so many years for my PhD. And of course, I show appreciation to SNCC, who they enabled me to be here. And I greatly appreciate what they've done. So, but like getting into the work now. So the motivation, where did this work begin? And it all began with, as most works do, with a prior work, a predecessor. So Waves of Malice was a paper that we presented in 2019. And that work was a longitudinal measurement of the malicious file delivery ecosystem on the web. And in essence, we were basically trying to model and understand malware delivery networks, their structures, and especially that entire ecosystem on the web, and also track it over a period of time. And what we did is that we used download metadata to empower that analysis. So this data was provided by Symantec, and it allowed us to do this characterization of malware delivery networks. The next question after concluding that study is, what else could this data tell us? You know, it gave us a unique perspective into these distributed and diverse delivery infrastructures. And one question that came to mind was, how effective are botnet takedowns on malware delivery? And that's a difficult question to answer for many reasons. But just, you know, to highlight some key terms. So a botnet itself is a network of malware-affected devices, and this network is controlled by a single actor. And the other term, takedown. So that's just any offensive technique that's used to disrupt botnets, these malicious operations. So what was the aim of this research? I've highlighted it in a short intro, but basically the key thing is that we wanted to analyze the evolution of malware delivery net operations that were targeted for takedown. So understanding more about their behaviors before and after a takedown. Specific questions that we try to answer is, firstly, after a takedown occurs, simply what happens next? That's the most basic question. And we have a unique perspective on this in order to answer this question. Also, how did the operators react? So that's like looking at more specific behaviors. Then the second area of questioning was looking at these malware operations that we know suffered takedown counter operations. Were there any additional or better intervention points that could have been exploited? And of course, answering these 2 questions is for the benefit of the security community, especially for carrying out future takedowns. Okay, so how do we actually go about answering these questions? And that's the methodology I'll run you through. So start with the data set. So Symantec, again, as our previous study, they provided us a mass or download metadata. And this data is generated by users of their products. So we have over 80 million download events from 12 million users. And these events is basically collected over the course of a year. So October 2015 to the end of September 2016. And the way we sample the data is actually we took 24 hours, so a single day of download activity once per week. There's loads of questions why we did this, but I think the key thing here is that we had to tackle the challenge of volume. Like the data comes to almost terabytes, and especially at the time, we were limited on computational resources and in order to carry out our analysis, we decided to just do this sampling. But obviously the other aspect is we want a longitudinal aspect. We want to see how behaviors evolve. So that's why we took over the course of a year. Another thing that we did is we did a bit of filtering. So we focused more on malicious files as much as we could. And the reason being was a number of reasons, but one main reason is, again, to deal with the computational challenge in that there's usually many more benign files in the wild than malicious ones. And we saw that with this data set. So in order to limit the scope of the study, we used Symantec's own internal reputation score in order to help us filter out as many benign files as we could. Now, what does a download event look like? very simply, it just has all of the data that we need to understand if a file is the payload, where it's delivered from and who delivers it. So if it's delivered by another file, the dropper or the parent file, whatever you want to call it, we can understand and characterize that relationship. We can also know the server that delivered it, either through a URL, an IP address, or if there's any like sort of redirection that was involved when the user actually downloaded that file. So we can map the landing page to the actual download URL. So all of this information is in the download event. And basically we use the same graph building technique as we did in the previous work. So that's the Waves of Malice paper. And the figure on the right demonstrates this technique. But the key points here is that for each unique element in the infrastructure, so each file host, like the URL or IP address, we represent them as nodes. And just a good point, something to point out here is that for a single file, if it's downloaded 1,000 times, we still represent it as a single node. So that was our methodology in terms of how we represent these networks. And the key point of this technique is, well, I think the key benefit is that it allows us to see and to understand these networks, both from the server side level, so like understanding the connections, like from in terms of IP addresses, domains, as well as the client side. So we can see the files that are downloaded onto end devices, what they're doing, and mainly downloading other files. Okay, so I've talked about methodology that we used in the previous work, but in terms of this new work, what additional steps did we need to take? So especially for tracking and analyzing operations. So we've got 24-hour graph snapshots for every day in our data set. So for each snapshot, the first thing we do is we label each file as much as we can with a label to know if it's malware or if it's a potentially unwanted program and the specific family. We use VirusTotal as our ground truth data source, which is a database that you can query it with a file hash and it will tell you if it's been detected as malware by various antivirus products. And AV Class, this tool is a great tool, definitely for us, but in essence, it takes VirusTotal data and makes it firstly more interpretable to a human analyst, but also it makes the labels a lot more consistent. So we've done this labeling, and on the right, you can see we've got two families that have been identified, foo and bar. But now we actually care about the foo operation in this instance. So foo is going to be our target family. We want to understand the foo malware operation. So we aggregate all the foo nodes in the graph. The next thing we do is we aggregate all of the nodes that are connected to this target family. And that aggregation or that subgraph we've now built basically represents the global delivery operation for this foo malware. And then basically taking that subgraph, we can just generate whatever metric we want. We can now use this subgraph that characterizes the operation, and then we can just basically define metrics that will represent some characteristic or another relating to the operation. And here I've just taken a table straight from the paper, but this basically shows the 20 metrics that we defined. And we motivated in the paper of why we defined them, why we think they're valuable. And in essence, we group them like you've got aggregate network activity at the top. So like, for instance, the number of URLs that are involved in download activity per day for any operation, number of countries that are involved where they have servers located. Then other groups of metrics like evasion indicators, aggregate download activity, relational dynamics, and all the way to polymorphism indicators. So again, this gives us a diverse perspective for each operation. And this is again just for demonstration purposes, but you can see a group of metrics now represented as a graph. And I like pictures, but more than that is a picture tells 1,000 words. And it really helps us to really understand how these behaviors evolve for each operation in great detail. All right, so that's really the methodology covered. And last thing is just which operations did we study? So we needed to focus on operations that suffered takedowns between that period, October 2015 to September 2016. And we found 3. So Drydex was the first, and obviously this is looking online, looking at other sources, industry reports and other research. Drydex was the first, and that's a banking Trojan. It's been known to operate only as a payload, so basically doesn't deliver any other malware. It just does its own malicious activity. Known to spread through malicious emails, adjacent networks, and exploit kits hosted on compromised pages. The takedown that was carried out against it was a 60-day DNS sinkhole, followed by a disinfection campaign. And in essence, a sinkhole basically disrupts the communication channels between the devices, the end user devices that have been infected with the malware, and the command and control servers, which can issue commands to them. So this technique that was used to disrupt, was meant to disrupt any communications between these hosts, was carried out over a 60-day period from early October 2015, led by the FBI. And something worth noting here also is that 2 other takedowns occurred just before this one, between August and September of 2015. And those were led by the FBI and UK law enforcement. I think it was the NCA, if I remember correctly. And that's just worth noting. In fact, I'll just stop there, but I'll say it's worth noting for later slides. Next family is Dorkbot. And that's a family of worms known to steal data from compromised systems, disable security applications, and deliver other malware. So it's a really bad form of malware. And the takedown carried out against it, again, a DNS sinkhole, even though this one was over a far shorter period. It was like over a couple of days for what sources showed. But it was followed by a seizure operation. So physical server infrastructure was seized by law enforcement. And this occurred in December 2015. Then finally, we have Repatri, interesting one. And the reason being is, well, firstly, it's a dedicated drop of malware. So all it does is deliver other malware. Well, that's all it's been known to do. And it's been, in fact, most known for delivering Dia during this time period. What was interesting is that we actually identified a correlation between a takedown carried out against Dia in November 2015 and a significant drop in Repatri download activity. So that was what we observed in our previous paper. So there wasn't a takedown carried out against Repatri as far as we can tell, but the fact that there was this significant drop, this correlation between the Dia takedown and Repatri activity, that implies there's a relationship. We don't know what it is. You can't say exactly what that relationship, what it characterizes, but it's definitely worth, we felt anyway, it's worth investigating. So that's why we decided to analyze Repatri activity in the context of the Dia takedown. And just to be more specific, the Dia takedown was an arrest and seizure. So the actual operators of the Dia malware were arrested and the infrastructure seized in November 2015. All right, so that's it for the methodology. On to the key results, and I'm basically summarizing the key takeaways, and much more in the paper, but obviously I don't have the time to go into that. So starting with takedown resilience and predictability. So first things first, and no big surprise, each malware operation responded differently. But I think what was quite interesting here was that each malware operation that we studied showed some level of resilience, and probably to varying degrees, I'd say. So for the first one, Dridex, and the figures on the right show this. Dridex actually significantly increased their server usage during that 60-day sinkhole carried out against them. So we're seeing a massive increase in their server activity. And what we found specifically was like an increase in the number of servers they use based in the US and in the UK. So the figures on the right show this. You've got the number of URLs used per day and the number of IPs used per day. And that first period, the first 2 months or so, that's where you get that massive increase in a year. And obviously, I don't know about you, but me, if I'm hearing a DNS sinkhole operations being carried out, I'd probably expect the opposite. Dorkbot, and in our opinion, showed no major changes to its operation after the takedown. And this is, again, is subjective, and I'd agree with anyone who says that. But I'll say why we believe there's no major changes. I'm looking at the 2 figures on the right. So the first brown figure is the number of URLs. So this is their URL activity. We see that after the takedown around 26th of November, just after it anyway, we see there's a massive drop in Dorkbot with the number of URLs involved in downloads. But then it spikes up again. Then a couple of weeks later, falls again. And then we get this cyclic behavior for the rest of the year. And in fact, in my opinion, it looks like that cyclical behavior could have even begun before the takedown occurred. So this cyclicity, it seems to have been something that was constant in DorkBot's operation. And overall, the levels don't appear to change much. And a similar thing on the right with number of downloads. Just before the takedown, we see is dropping. It still drops a little bit after the takedown, but then over the course of the year, it's more or less level. And even at the very end of the year, we see there's a massive spike, a huge spike in DorkBot downloads. And I'll note that for later. But again, this indicates resilience in one form or another. And then finally, we've got Upatre. And definitely, I'd concede that Upatre did show a significant drop in the short term. And in fact, that's what we saw in the first study. That was why we even decided to study it. And we've got the domain count on the bottom left, IP count on the bottom right. So, and the takedown, I don't know if you can see, but it's a very thin orange strip around, between 29th October, 26th November. But basically, see, that's where you get a significant drop in that server activity. But what's interesting is on the left, the domain figure, you see there's after a couple of months, a significant rise in the number of domains being used. But you don't get that same rise in the number of IPs. So that led us to investigate a little bit more. And we basically found that on a high level, there was a significant change in the way that they carried out their delivery operation. And it was basically a change from a distributed delivery architecture, like using multi-region servers around the world, to a much more centralized one in that latter part of the year. And specifically, we looked at the domains because that's what the figure led us on this hunt. And we found that they basically moved from using these multi-region servers and domains such as Yahoo Mail and AFX.ms, which is what we found to be like backend servers for Microsoft Outlook, to another group of servers, the main server being alphafile.net. And that is basically a service where you can upload and download software, a content distribution network. And we also saw many domains, hundreds, in fact, that looked to be like, it looked like it's basically using domain generation algorithms. So that's a well-known technique used by malware operators to make the infrastructure harder to detect. And it had this constant structure, sling2 dot, a random sequence of words, then .ru, the Russian top-level domain. So this is, again, indicative of resilience to takedown, even though it occurred several months after. So then another thing we looked at was trying to understand these behaviors. Is there any behavioral models that we can map to how these operators seem to be behaving? And we looked into criminology. And criminology is interesting in that it recognizes and already has some models of offender behavior as a result of some anti-crime intervention. And two of them that are interesting that we noted in the paper. So the first is displacement. And as it is in the name, is simply a change in an offender's behavior in order to circumvent an intervention. Second behavior of interest is defiance. And that's simply, you do an intervention, I don't like it, and I'm gonna react negatively and do much worse. That's basically it in a nutshell. So it's more retaliative. And the malware operators' reactions, in our opinions, were characteristic of these behaviors. Even though what I'll say is that we're making an assumption in this case that if we're talking about these models, we're assuming that the behaviors that we see is linked or as a result of the takedowns that occurred. And obviously we note that assumption. But what examples do I have to give? So firstly, Drydex itself, it ramped up server usage during that 60-day sinkhole, also focusing more servers in the US and the UK. And if you recall, those are the countries where the law enforcement, FBI and the NCA carried out takedowns against them a few months before. So again, both of those behaviors, assuming a causal link, is characteristic of displacement and defiance. Then Upatre shifting to a more centralized infrastructure, changing its modus operandi several months after the dire takedown. If it is linked to the takedown that was carried out, that's simply displacement. There's no two ways about it. But of course, we know that assumption that's been made there. What do we learn? At least from these observations that we made, what we can say concretely is that all of these operations continued, whether their behaviors are linked to the takedowns or not. We saw that they were all resilient. But so these side effects that are negative and unwanted, we believe if you're able to factor these in and plan these as part of the takedown strategies, you should have more effective takedowns. So it's not just carrying out the takedown, but thinking about how you manage the effects in the long term, or at least we believe that's the way forward. But of course, the question comes again, that the fact that these operations can continue to operate despite suffering takedowns, or at least not in the case of Repatriate, that was a separate a takedown against a separate family. But the fact is that are takedowns the only way forward, or the most effective way forward? That question came again for what we observed. And we made some comments in the paper, but I won't go into them now. And just to talk about the unpredictable, so these are things that we saw that had never been documented before and appear to be anomalous. So Dridex, as if you recall, is only known to operate as a payload, as a banking Trojan. It steals banking credentials. But what we found is that it's also a secret malware distributor. The figure on the right shows this clearly, and it was delivering bursts of ransomware, backdoor malware, and competing brands of banking Trojans. So, this has never before been documented, but uncovered with this technique. DorkBot itself, as I mentioned before, there's a massive spike in downloads of DorkBot malware through another malware family, Ruskill, and that's a backdoor. So we observed this, and again, it hadn't been noted before in any literature or any industry report. So for us, it indicates an emerging business relationship. We don't know why it occurs, but we've seen it. And Repatriate itself, similar to DorkBot, in the latter part of the year, exhibited many deliveries through upstream malware. So they changed their delivery model in more ways than one. We don't know why this occurs, but again, this is useful for security analysts in terms of tracking these behaviors. So what did we learn? So we're not saying our technique is the best, of course not. It just offers one perspective. But the fact that our technique was able to show something new, we believe in general, the security community can really improve monitoring. And what do we mean by that? Simply, correlating multiple data sources, we believe, is the best way to get the most context and the deepest insight into these operations. So in our case, we download metadata, but if you're able to correlate with text data from social media sites or dark web forums or ISP network traffic, it will give us more context and more information. All right, so this slide I'm going to actually fly through because there's details in the paper, but I don't want to waste too much time on it. But basically, we saw that all operations that we studied, they used distributed delivery methods. That was actually core to their delivery model. Dridex itself used servers in up to 35 different countries. And it just got a geospatial figure that shows that those servers, the distribution. And again, this is characteristic of all the operations that we studied. DorkBot itself constantly rotated between its main delivery servers will change every couple of weeks. And these will be in different international regions. Repatriate itself, as I mentioned before, used multi-region content distribution networks. So all of this makes server-based takedowns more difficult. There's the aspect of redundancy that these operators have extra infrastructure around the globe. But also detection is more difficult. Like if you're trying to blacklist based on IPs or domains, they have many more IPs and domains that they can cycle through. So we learned that two things. Well, firstly, is more of an implication that there's going to be more coordination required by the international security community because of this. But also these content distribution networks that keep being abused, we saw this in the first paper, we see it again, they need to improve their security hygiene if they're being abused so much. And then finally, this is the last key takeaway, so I'm definitely rounding up, is polymorphism and superbinaries. So polymorphism refers to a malware's ability to change its identifiable features to avoid detection. And we saw, again, similar to what the literature has already actually found, but we reconfirmed, is that all three malware use polymorphism rigorously. So basically, they're changing their file hashes constantly and using like hundreds each day. DorkBot was definitely the most elusive, and in fact, it almost beat semantic detection systems like around 50% of the time. But I think this is probably a bit more interesting that we observed the Pareto's principle, the 80-20 rule, specifically a minority of files being responsible for most download activity. And just to elaborate with an example, Dridex, less than 1% of its binaries were responsible for all drop-in activity over the year, which is a massive skew. So we learned that, of course, with hash-based tracking, if you're into that, good luck. But that's a very difficult challenge and a difficult way to track malware operations. But we believe that if you're able to focus on these binaries that carry out most activity, what we call super binaries, definitely you'll be able to disrupt malware delivery more effectively. And that's based much more in the paper, but I'm just going to summarize. So in terms of limitations, we inherited some from our previous study using a similar technique, such as having a limited view on only one stage of the malware value chain, using virus total, which is a benefit. Obviously, we needed it, but at the same time, it has limitations of file coverage. There's obviously the potential of false positives. Then there's other issues like a lack of ground truth on these operations. So where it makes it more difficult to map what happens in reality with what we see in the data. And other issues like survivorship bias and generalizability. And the most general one is the correlation does not imply causation. So we're only able to state what we observe and speculate, but we can't say what caused this or that. So just to summarize, key takeaways, we use download metadata to devise a novel technique to model, track, and dissect malware delivery operations on the web. Code is on the GitHub, not all of it, but at least some to get you started. And then we apply this technique to monitor 3 different malware operations. And we found that malware operators tend to move the operations elsewhere after a takedown. And we learned that these behaviors should be factored into strategies to manage the side effects. We saw the common use of distributed delivery architectures making coordinated takedowns harder. So this obviously implies the need for greater coordination and better security practices amongst the service providers being abused. We saw the presence of super binaries, which carry out most delivery activity in an operation. So if you detect these, you'll be able to disrupt, or we believe, disrupt malware delivery the most. And finally, we observe things that have never been seen before, which is always nice to do. But we believe in general, we can all benefit with better monitoring techniques. And that is it. Thank you for your patience, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Colin. So we have a question there. Oko?
Thank you very much, Colin. Very beautiful work, right? For me, it seems a little bit of history. I mean, you have a data set of 5 years old, which is quite a lot in this world of malware delivery and takedown, right? So you already had this methodology. Didn't you apply during your work for next years and see how this evolves in time?
That definitely is a good question. I think simply the challenge was that I couldn't, as carrying out this work, getting newer data was difficult. There was a significant change business-wise, which I won't go into. But what I would say, and this is commenting on the temporal aspects of these results, and it's something, in fact, I was asked this question before, is that we observe things that, like, for instance, distributed delivery architectures being used by top malware operations. This is something that's been observed as early as 2010. Even, in fact, I think some studies have seen it before. And this is something that's been occurring for now at least half a decade. So we believe there's no reason why that's not going to be common today. If you think about Emotech, TrickBot, some of the top botnets that have been, or they've in fact faced takedowns recently, you'll notice that their own servers, they basically use that same distributed delivery architecture. And there's other things, but I think the key point is that some of these things are always changing, of course, but there are some underlying factors or some underlying techniques that are used over a longer period. And we believe those are the key takeaways that we think were important to note.
Thank you. Another question, yes?
Thank you, Colin, for the presentation. Maybe my question is related to the previous one. How did you choose which malware operations you were going to analyze? Or were those the only ones that were in your data set?
Right, so there were hundreds of thousands of different malware that we're able to detect in the data. But in terms of ones that are known to have been taken down in that period, there's far fewer. This is simply going online, searching through as many industry reports we could find, and Google is obviously your best friend. But the takedowns, there's only a few that are carried out each year. So that obviously limits the scope. Then basically a number of other malware takedowns that occurred in that period, we just either didn't see it in our data set. And in fact, that was the main reason. We didn't actually see that, we didn't see any malware label that pertained to those families. So these three we're able to actually track. We observed their binaries in a data set. And we focus on those. Of course, that introduces bias in some form, but what are you going to do about that? That's a challenge that we have to know.
Okay, so I have lots of questions, but for the sake of timing, we have to thank the speaker another time and then move on. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, sir.